marker of my own gravestone. About now.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome to the Promethean Tides. I am General. As per usual, I am joined by Breaker. What is going on, Breaker?
5, 5, 5, 5, 5. This is the secret of the trickster. Always turning 5 times.
I still think that that's a whole bunch of schizophrenic gobbledygook, but fair enough. So I'm actually I'm gonna upload this over the weekend, but I will be out of town, so we're kind of pre-recording this. So I hope that no huge news happened, because it would be nice to cover huge news. It's always fun to cover huge news, but I figured that we would do something a little bit different for this episode. We've been doing a lot of going over the news and going over some memes, but I figured it might be fun to shake it up a little bit, and we just do some dialectic about some philosophy stuff, because it's a off camera. Breaker and I discuss a lot of this stuff just as a hobby. So yeah, we'll I guess we'll just get into it. So we have a slight disagreement over which is more basal, I guess. So I guess that ultimately ontology is the most basal, right? It's just the study of reality. But which is closer to ontology? Is it axiology, or is it metaphysics slash pataphysics? So I guess that's overall the question that I guess we can start out with. We can go wherever, but that's like a starting point for the conversation. I guess Breaker, if you want to go first, I think most people probably understand what metaphysics is. I don't think anyone understands what pataphysics is. So maybe you could explain a little bit of that.
Well, to put it in like basic terms, pataphysics kind of is very slippery in this way because it kind of defies discrete definitions by its very nature. But if I were to make my best attempt of a Narn argument to describe pataphysics, and this is an argument I am not making, pataphysics would simply be imaginary solutions.
Imaginary solutions. What does that mean?
Well, given any particular problem, now you might hear this as like there's a lot of like artistic and creative people that employ this all the time, like explicitly and implicitly, to come up with creative works and stuff. And this is sort of where this started out. If you think about it a little more, it's just like, what is that ineffable origin of imagination itself? Or I could have a problem of like, there is an evil dragon in my fantasy world wreaking havoc, which is already an imaginary problem in and of itself. Now, what would be my imaginary solution to this problem? Well, the heroes have to obtain the horn of the magical unicorn in order to slay the dragon. But in obtaining the magical horn of the unicorn must die. So they base that there's this tension and this choice they have to make. It's like, do they want to slay the dragon and kill the unicorn, or do they want to allow the dragon to run amok and let the unicorn live?
Okay, so what is it? Just like is it just like pure human creativity? It's just whatever your imagination can conjure?
That's part of the equation. It's insofar as you could imagine problems and solutions all day long. Like that's more than enough of an apt description if you want to stop there. The more pressing question is, And I know there's a bunch of like more scientific and rationalistic minded explanations for this, which we will probably go into in more depth. Where does this ineffable, emergent, like anti-reason originate from? Because none of this is like technically furthering any type of like survival goal for me to feed and breed and replicate and do all of these things that we're technically supposed to do from the materialistic humanist view of what humans are, is like breeding machines technically.
No. I disagree. I would say that uh, actually, DNA does this all the time. So DNA mutates. It tries a whole bunch of different stuff. Most of it is crap. Most of it doesn't work. But sometimes it in the infinite chaos of, well, technically not infinite, but the in the explosion of combinatorics that you can get from all the different ways that you can mutate a DNA. Sometimes it's useful, and so that's why it does it. That's actually how you get evolution, and I think that happens in the human mind. That's why we have creativity. That's why we have imagination. A lot of the things that we create are shit, but sometimes you stumble upon something that's golden, and so it's worth doing it.
I would caution you, though, that's kind of attributing. I know why you're doing it, but at the same time, it's attributing like a type of engineering acumen to DNA that I don't think it possesses in the abstract human way that you're imposing upon it.
No, it doesn't do it consciously or intently, but it does do it. As does the human mind, because I'm not sure that we even have free will. So can you even give intent to humans either?
I think it would be more accurate to say, specifically in the case of DNA, that DNA exists and then it's subject to like a bunch of very complex interconnected systems of, there could be an errant gamma ray particle that just so happens to fly through one particular strand of DNA and knock out one of the codes. And it just so happens that that particular code, that particular atomic decaying particle knocked out, encoded for, I don't know, not having freckles. And so that human is then born with freckles. Just because the sun burped a particle in its general direction.
Yeah, no, that definitely happens. Probably all the time. Yeah, absolutely. But organisms seem to actually favor some mutation sometimes. So I'll give you a couple examples. When it comes to bacteria, right? If you put them into a stressful environment, they actually they downregulate some of the proteins that protect their DNA, and so actually their DNA starts mutating at a higher rate so that they can find some way to escape the stressful situation, right? So like if you apply antibiotics, the bacteria will actually start to mutate their DNA faster. I also within organisms, there are some genes that are extremely well protected, right? Like the genes for the creation of a ribosome, which are like super important. They're like the core of DNA based life, essentially. Those are super important. Those are conserved heavily, and the organism protects those genes at all costs. But then there's like some peripheral genes that aren't really quite as important and haven't been in the system for nearly as long. You know, it's like a new gene or whatever, and those are actually subject to much more mutation. And then it's like, okay, genes that have been in the system for longer tend to accrue more and more and more protection and become less and less and less mutated. So it seems as though there is like, I won't say that there's intent, but there are processes that exist to induce mutation, 100%.
This reminds me of when I read Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene Theory. I still need to go through the extended phenotype, but I remember he brought up this point, and he likened like genetic sequences to like an encyclopedia. But then as he expounded upon the metaphor, it kind of like emerged. There's this weird emergent complexity that happens as he's writing these passages. In the meta narrative of what he's writing itself, it's just like, okay, now in an encyclopedia that was very much as close to DNA as we could make an encyclopedia, what would happen is that every now and then a letter of the book would inexplicably change to a different letter. Now, this is all well and good up to a point, but after a certain amount of time, you probably realize as this goes on, if these changes to these letters are totally random in nature, you would eventually end up with an encyclopedia of pure gibberish.
Well, unless there was a selection mechanism to make sure that it didn't become gibberish and had to continue to be useful to whichever human was reading it. Because, I mean, I guess that in this case we're talking about a mimetic structure, right? So it has to have some sort of usefulness in order for anyone to continue to buy the book in this circumstance.
And this also like gives you a bit of a clue that because I know I talked to my Catholic friend about evolution, and his arguments against evolution are usually much more nuanced than the standard creationist, God did it, her type of arguments you hear from a lot of creationist-minded people. It has more to do with like what is meant by random, and there's a moral dimension to it too, because he's a Catholic, where if you kind of mythologize and turn evolutionary biology into a religion, which I've explicitly made it clear to him that's not what I'm doing. Maybe certain other people would do something more akin to that, but I know like the Richard Dawkins and Four Horsemen of Atheism type people kind of implicitly do this, although if you confronted them with this directly, they would probably deny it. But anyway, the type of quote-unquote randomness, because like the example I just gave the encyclopedia, if the randomness were this pure, metaphysically abstracted, pure randomness, pure chaos, pure 50-50, you would end up with gibberish. Like if time was still going forward and the randomness was pure and metaphysical in its derivation, you would end up with gibberish in a certain amount of time. Now that might be a very long span of time, but that would inevitably happen. So I don't actually think, from my perception, that true 50-50 metaphysical, mathematical randomness is what's happening in the case of evolution and emergent complexity or any emergently complex systems.
Well, I think that when it comes to like an organism, right? So an organism, it's three objects that all exist at once, and of course, all three of these objects have sublayers to them. But generally speaking, you have the genotype, that's the actual replicator. You have the phenotype that carries the replicator around, the genotype, and then you have the memotype. And so, like with humans, an example of that would be something like language, right? Language is this complex object that also evolves, but it evolves to be useful to humans, and that's the mimetics. So overall, that's what an organism is. If you look at let's say like a bear, obviously it has a genotype and a phenotype, but the memotype might be the mother teaching its cub how to hunt, or the mating dance that the male bears do to get the female bear, something like that. I don't think though that if you take an organism and you start changing the genotype, I don't think that actually tends towards randomness, because like yes, it would if it was in isolation, but in the context, it's playing a game. It has to replicate itself. It has to survive and reproduce. So there is a selection pressure on it to make sure that when there are changes, when there are mutations, if they're decaying towards just random chaos, then those aren't useful. They're selected against. But things that actually build structures, those are selected for, and so you get an emergence of various systems, various structures, and then also those structures actually they start having complex interactions between themselves, because why build one structure when you could build 20,000 structures? Like the number of genes in the human genome, you have 20,000 structures, and those can all start talking to one another and have a whole bunch of different interactions, and that's how you get emergence at the cellular level. So I mean, I don't agree with this argument. But I think that we're getting a little bit away from the original question.
Yeah, it does come back around in a way, because I'm probably not the most big-brained, intelligent person to be able to make this type of argument. So, feel free to leave comments that I'm a total idiot. But when I think about something like this, it's actually very interesting that there seems to be almost a type of subtle counter entropy that's happening. Now, this would only work with the assumption that all of this randomness ultimately tends towards some type of perfect equilibrium, like this mathematically pure abstract randomness. So depending on how closely you adhere to that model of the randomness, you would have to have some type of counter entropy injected into the system from some point. Now, assuming that, which I think you're more likely to do, that it's not this abstractly pure metaphysical randomness that's actually happening, that actually leads to an equally interesting question. It's like, you don't necessarily need counter entropy or extropy to be injected into the system to reinvigorate this. What's more interesting is that the randomness itself seems to be asymmetrical.
I don't know. I think that what happens is it's a constant testing of possible solutions, right? It's always testing life, and this is what I would describe as the nature god. It's not like an actual metaphysical god, but it's like it's basically the process of DNA just existing on Earth. But that there's a pressure to replicate, and so things test a whole bunch of different possible solutions to continuing to exist and replicate, and then one of them works out, and then okay, well, that's the winning one, and then you test a whole new space, and then one of them works, and then you test a whole new space, and then one of them works. And I mean, ultimately, I think that's what life on planet Earth does, right? Like, how many different organisms are there? How many different species are there, right? So every species is actually just a way of testing a mechanism to continue DNA's existence on Earth, right? Like, oh, DNA can exist as a plant. Well, okay, that's a good way of existing. Let's keep going with that one. Oh, DNA can also exist as a herbivore, like a hippo or something. Okay, well, that's a good one. Let's keep going with that as well. And it's just every species is basically testing ways that DNA can continue to exist on planet Earth. That's like the purpose of I think all of it.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. Usually the question I end up asking when confronted with things like this is like, okay, it would be more interesting to know what is the origin of this asymmetry. Like, I know you and me several times in the past have had this conversation, like, nature doesn't give you this pure metaphysical abstract 50-50 random like what you argued the universe is more likely to do. Nature gives you something that's slightly loaded and biased in the what we agreed upon terms, the yes direction. Like, nature is very slightly biased in like continued replication and continued existence of all these different types of species. So there's some type of very subtle thumb on this scale. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be a divine, metaphysical, transcendental God thumb like Christians might argue. It could be something much more like inherent to the nature of reality itself or the nature of life itself. But in either one of those cases, this is still a very interesting question that the only people I know who address this in the intellectual sphere are Eric Weinstein and Christopher Langan. Like, what is this foundational type of asymmetry that can give rise to any type of cogent matter whatsoever?
I mean, okay, I'm a little bit confused by what you mean by this asymmetry. Where does this where are you saying that this asymmetry exists? Is it because you were talking about entropy and then like the opposing force against entropy. So you're saying that like the extropy is just slightly outweighing the entropy? Is that the
That's one way of saying it, yes, because if you think, okay, if it was balanced in the chaos direction, then nothing definable would ever arise in any universe ever. If it was perfectly balanced, then there would be no movement, there would be no change of states at all, and nothing would arise ever. The only way that anything ever happens and why there's something rather than nothing is if the yes direction of this scale is very slightly biased.
So okay, so I say that and I'm not the only one to say it, but my position is that emergent properties come from the intersection of chaos and order. So I guess in that instance, would you say that emergence happens best when it's like 51% order and 49% chaos? Is that what I'm kind of picking up?
Yeah, it would necessarily have to be too, because if they were equally balanced in an absolutely abstract sense, they would just zero out and nothing would happen. If it was biased in the chaos direction, then purple pear trees with unicorn horns would drop cherries. Like, it wouldn't make any sense. It would be less coherent than that, actually.
I don't know. I feel like you could also have emergent structures that are 49% order and 51% chaos. I don't know why it is that there has to necessarily be a bias. And I mean, because if it's slightly more chaotic, then maybe it trends towards chaos. But if it's slightly more ordered, it trends towards order. And you never want to go full order or full chaos, because I mean, the chaos is like it's just like white noise. It's just random stuff. But order is like it's like a diamond. It's crystallized and it's unmoving and it doesn't do anything.
More likely, if it was biased in the chaos direction, it's like, just think of all the things that are complexly interconnected here. If it was biased in the chaos direction, it might even go a completely different direction in time. If it was biased in chaos, it might just be null entropic and go backwards in time, and you would never encounter it anyway.
Well,
it could be chaotic.
I'm not certain that chaotic leaning emergent properties could do time travel. I'm not certain about that, but
what I'm talking about when I say order and chaos, at least, is like these perfectly abstract notions that are diametrically opposed to each other. So if we think about anything emerging in the universe that exists anywhere, even imaginary substances in our minds alone, they have to conform to some type of order at the most basal levels. Like, they have to conform to be moving in linear time in a direction that we could perceive them if these objects are to be perceivable, and they'll have to be progressing in a certain order of events. If we think of time as an order of operations for the existence of any and everything in the fabric of space-time, everything that does exist in the universe would have to fall into that particular type of groove to even exist at all.
Well, I will give you this. There appears to be a very, very slight imbalance between matter and antimatter at the beginning of the universe. A very slight imbalance, but matter won out.
Mm, yeah, that's the kind of thing that I'm getting at, actually. Now, the questions I ask is like, and these may be things that mere mortals such as us, or even God machine AIs, or whatever, future emergent organisms like the freaking Spacing Guild in the Dune universe that are all brains in jars level shit, like whatever is thinking about this at any point in the universe may never get to answering these types of penultimate questions of existence. But nonetheless, if you find yourself interfacing with this type of weirdness, this is basically how all scientific discoveries and paradigm breaking discoveries in any field, not just science, but in any field, how all this comes to be. Like, geometry technically exists in the Western world because a crazy old Greek guy drew a triangle in the sand and then streaked through a village shouting Eureka. Of all the ways humans could have come to know of geometric shapes, it was a crazy old Greek guy drawing triangles in the sand. There is no like ought statement like it ought to have happened that way. That's just how it happened, and it's not necessarily sensical when you think about it deeply. That's totally a nonsensical, whimsical, random event. Like, out of all the things that could have happened, it was a crazy Greek guy drawing triangles in the sand. Like, what the fuck?
Well, yeah, he I would say that okay, so to try to take it back to the original question at hand. My position is that of axiology, so that's essentially it's the philosophy of values, right? And that sounds like it should be quite abstract, but actually I think it's incredibly basal in my perspective. But in that a triangle is a platonic object. It's metaphysical, and it's also mimetic. So it's mimetic and metaphysical, and it can be used as a model for things that actually exist in reality, but it is necessarily a tool, and it's not an accurate model. There are no platonic triangles in reality, as far as we can tell, based on our sensory data. So, uh, so, but it is a useful tool. I agree with you. Triangles can be incredibly useful for a lot of goddamn things. 100% agree.
Just to touch upon axiology for a moment. I also find it strange that axiology itself, insofar as like the human instantiation of axiology is concerned, now you could probably make a very similar argument with any type of biological life that has anything remotely resembling even the most basal forms of agency about it, like bacteria swimming away from alcohol, for example, could be an example of this too. But even in this, we also have an asymmetry, but we have like a type of meta-perspectival asymmetry that's weighted in the opposite direction and is actually biased towards chaos. And I can illustrate this with an extremely simple example of the old snake in the grass fallacy. It's like, okay, you're outside and a bush is rustling. And you're just like, oh no, a bush is rustling. And before you can even make a conscious thought, it's like, get away from that rustling bush. And why is your instinct bias in the direction that this rustling bush, seemingly innocuous rustling bush, is somehow an agent of chaos and doom?
So I can't know for certain. I can guess, but I can say almost for certain that monkeys that didn't jump away from the rustling bush survived less than less frequently than the monkeys that did jump away from the rustling bush. Like that's a true statement.
Yeah, there's like the bias is there, and you could go into like scientific and evolutionary explanations in this natural selection paradigm where it's just like there could be something dangerous in the bush. Rather than sticking around to investigate, just get away from the bush and worry about it later.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, this is let me I'll break down my argument. Of course, Breaker, you've heard it, but just for the audience. So I in my formulation, you you have qualia, right? I think therefore I am depending on how you want to interpret Descartes. I've heard other people have other interpretations of it. Fine, whatever. But you know that you exist because you can experience qualia, right? You might be living in the Matrix right now. You might be a brain, what do you call it? A Boltzmann brain just kind of floating in the universe that happened to have been randomly generated. All of these are possible things, you know, that could be taking place, but you know that you exist because you do experience qualia of some sort. Now, the qualia that you experience, it could be, let's say, seeing the color red, right? Or it could be being hungry, and so now you want to go find food. Or it could be that you're thirsty, so go find water. It could be that, oh, well, you're actually underwater and you're drowning, and you feel yourself really wanting to expel carbon dioxide. So, so go breathe. These are the fundamental things that drive man, and I think that then man comes up with these mimetic constructions and these metaphysical objects in order to pursue those more basic qualia, right? You don't like feeling hungry. You have to do something to alleviate this. You'll notice that pain exists, and it doesn't matter how much philosophy you've done. It doesn't matter how much you try to logic and reason your way out of it. Pain is unpleasant for everyone. It doesn't matter what you do. Pain is unpleasant. Period. That is so that exists. And you can't get rid of it. You can't get rid of the qualia that exists. And I also want to point out, language actually cannot describe qualia, right? Language can describe all sorts of things. It can describe our models of how we believe protons work. It can describe our models of how we believe economics works. It can describe so many things, and yet there's an impasse when it comes to language. Language cannot describe qualia. How would you describe red to a blind man? How would you describe, I guess, the sound of music to someone who was born deaf? It's not possible to describe these things, which leads me to believe that probably these qualia, which basically what forms axiology, these are significantly more basal than language, and so I think that there is truth in the qualia. It's like, okay, I know I'm experiencing something. There's something resembling truth there, whereas when it comes to these constructions that mankind has made, because mankind is brilliant, we invent all sorts of tools. We invented language, we invented mathematics, we invented religion. It's all really cool stuff. But these things that we've constructed, they're not there's actually no truth there, and a lot of I think a lot of people they've made a mistake, and they've said, oh, well, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna look towards I'm gonna use logic that exists within language, and I'm gonna make logical arguments, and I'm gonna philosophize, and I'm gonna come to truth in that manner, or I'm gonna look at math and science. I'm gonna come to the real truth of reality through that. But you can't do it. The truth doesn't exist in the tool that you made. It would be like looking at a hammer and going, oh yes, there is truth in this hammer. No. These are tools. They're extremely useful tools, mind you. It was math and science that planted a monkey on the moon, and that's fantastic. That's amazing, and I like these tools a lot. I'm not dismissing them. My only position is that no matter how deeply you stare into these tools, there is not truth there. The truth is actually in the other direction. It's when you're hungry and you go, I'm hungry, I'm gonna get food, or I'm horny, I wanna fuck. That's where the truth actually exists. It's more basal in my opinion. Go ahead, Breaker.
Usually the arguments that we most often get into around the nature of axiology and human qualia, insofar as we argue these things for many long hours, if I were to put the finest point I could on what's at the heart of all my arguments with you about this particular topic, it would be that in everything you just described about axiology and human qualia, it's always chaos loaded. It always has that certain asymmetry towards doom. Everything you've just described, I'm hungry. Well, really, why you're hungry is because you're technically dying faster than you otherwise would be if you weren't hungry. Now, saying that I'm hungry, therefore eat is abstract process-oriented thinking that is actually not required for this equation.
Well, I think that yeah, the qualia is hunger, but then take any organism, be it a bacteria or a human, they try to alleviate their hunger, right? That's something that they tend to do because hunger is unpleasant. It's this object that exists and it goes, hey, I'm gonna make you feel bad. I'm going to induce some sort of pain in you so that you do the thing that makes damn sure that you replicate. And so that's not chaotic. That is how you that's literally how nature builds complex structures. I think that it's within the metaphysics and these mimetic tools that we've invented that actually there can be doom. Like you can go so deep into thinking about navel gazing that you decide that even though you were born with a dick, you should go ahead and chop it off and wear a dress. And obviously, that doesn't help your chances of furthering yourself in the gene pool, and yet people are doing it, and it's going against everything that nature fucking wants you to do. That's doom.
We celebrate diversity here, but anyway. Anyway. Okay. Like, refine it a bit more. Most of what I would say in rebuttal to that, I suppose, would be you don't need any logic or axioms to really make this argument. Well, it gets into like the realm of the ineffable. So in order for me to talk about it and have this argument, like, of course, I'm going to employ some type of metaphysical derivatives and these philosophically loaded terms that I use to describe it. But there are ways to experience this that are deeper than words, but that's not something I can tell you about explicitly. So what I will say is that the reason I think that they're like chaos / doom loaded is because you're in a, like, your very existence as a mortal replicating being is itself penultimately chaos loaded. Like, entropy is slowly eating away at you. The more complex you get to the level of an organism, entropy is eating away at more things in more different ways. Like, the entropy itself and the chaos itself is a very apophatically simple thing. But because you are a complex emergent system, the amount of things that chaos is touching is like exponentially exploding to greater and greater heights the more complexity is added into the system. And by the time you get to as complex an organism as any type of life form, even single cell life, of something that could feel like hunger and a need to survive, you're going to necessarily want to balance that scale out by adding order into the system. So the simplest way, the most apophatically simple way to describe eating would be to say it's like chaos is building, introduce order. But you only introduce order through the creation of other chaos, because you probably have to eat something else that's a complex, orderly system in and of itself, and very much doesn't want to be eaten by you. So everything you do under nature, bred in tooth and claw, is always going to be destroying something else to increase your own order, because order is as of limited supply. Like, light needs energy, darkness just happens.
Well, when it comes to qualia, you know, it's interesting that you're talking about the imbalance thing, because that also applies to the qualia that you experience, right? The most painful thing that you could experience is is it's much grander than the most I guess pleasant thing that you could experience, right? Like, eating a cheeseburger, that feels good. Having sex, that feels good. Drinking beer, that feels good. These are all really pleasant things. But like they're not on the scale, they're not nearly as pleasant as how unpleasant being lit on fire is. Like that, it's a, it's a big difference. Like even shooting up heroin, I think is. I mean, that I've never done it, but I hear that it's very 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 pleasant. But I bet even that is not on the same scale as how unpleasant being lit on fire is, right? So there does seem to be an imbalance there as well. Probably because I would imagine that I don't know why that is. Probably because it's useful, evolutionarily speaking, right? Like there's no free rides. Like life keeps kicking you. Keep going, keep going, keep going. It doesn't want you to feel too nice for too long, because then you're content, and then you stop I guess doing the best thing that you can do to replicate yourself. But yeah, there is an imbalance there, which is interesting.
Often leads me to wonder. Most of what I wonder about is the meta perspective nature behind that imbalance itself. As when I think about things like this, there are certain rarefied human experiences that I refer to as unparalleled experiences that can actually transcend these more primordial instincts into a level of religious ecstasy, would be one way of describing it, where the famous video of the Buddhist monk protesting the Vietnam War that literally pours himself with gasoline and lights himself on fire, and he burns to death while sitting in the lotus pose. That's a type of very rare thing that, insofar as we're aware, only humans are able to get to that type of rarefied experience.
Yeah,
of going against all the programming and getting out of the groove, as I call it, of the normal primordial instinctual drives and transcending that. You do have to admit that there are humans that exist that are capable of that. It's possible for you to sit until you starve to death. It's possible for some adepts at meditation and yoga to actually stop their own hearts and kill themselves with meditation.
I don't know if that last one is true, but I do agree. Like, actually, part of that is I think that that's kind of what will is, right? Like the human will. Like, yeah, I feel hungry, but I'm 50 pounds overweight, so I'm just gonna not eat, and I'm just going to endure the pain of the hunger, because I can kind of understand that maybe it's not good for me to to eat a donut even though I really want it. Maybe like I'm exercising and like oh god, it burns, I'm really tired, like this feels awful, but I can push through it, and I can have willpower to kind of try to override some of those qualia inputs. Absolutely.
The problem I have is that if this was only ever an emanation of material causes, like you often argue, why would something like this arise in humans, or anything else potentially for that matter, if everything we've been discussing so far is chaos loaded, like a version of chaos building up, introduce order? If it only ever emerged from purely material causes, you wouldn't actually expect to see these emergent behaviors of like suicidal, self-immolatory, transcendental, ecstatic events like this.
Well, I think that I think overall it's usually a bad idea to set yourself on fire, no matter the reason. But hey, people are gonna do people stuff.
I am not endorsing suicide, by the way. Don't mistake me.
Definitely not. But I think that human beings, they do have a fairly good ability to make predictions about what the future will be or become, and so they're willing to accept some amount of pain right now, so that they can I guess maybe have less pain in the future, right? It's like, okay, if I if I if I exercise and I eat well, and like these are kind of painful right now, then I won't end up with diabetes and my leg won't rot off in the future, and so that's good. I want to avoid pain and I want to maximize my happiness and in the future. So I'm willing to accept some amount of pain now, but ultimately all of that is still in service of wanting to not feel pain and feel pleasantness.
Even if you go through the chain of arguments, and I understand all of these arguments, like even if you go down the chain of like trying to rein this in to be purely reliant on material causes, even if you go down that chain of argumentation, you're still left with this bizarre unanswered question at the end of the day. It's just like, this would mean that there is a potentiality of emergence to lead to not only like insufficient systems that lead to a species extinction on a macro level over time because they couldn't hack it in the natural selection competitive environment. It also brings, yeah, that happens all the time. So you would kind of expect to see that. That's just like the cosmic roll of the dice level shit. Like you would expect to see, like with these finite creatures, eventually like terminating by no fault of their own because they couldn't hack it, for lack of a better term. What you wouldn't necessarily expect to see would be like if the emergence of things like suicidal cults, which I do not endorse, don't mistake me, but these like suicidal cults like the Hail Vomit cult and the Jim Jones Kool-Aid drinker motherfuckers, like if what you're describing is true, which I have not necessarily any reason to doubt it, this still means that there is a potentiality for a misappropriation or a maladaptation that leads to a catastrophic downturn on the graph and nosedives into oblivion really quick, and that this can necessarily happen at any time, and there's no guarantee whether or not something like that will happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I totally agree. So this is my distinction between religions and cults, right? Cults they tend to reduce your reproductive success, whereas religion tends to increase your reproductive success. And really, that's in my estimation, that's really the fundamental difference between the two of them. Now, both of these are mimetic objects that humans have constructed, 100%. But just because they're memes doesn't mean that they can't be dangerous. They can definitely harm you, and there's actually lots of examples of memes that exist right now today that harm the practitioners. So overall, there tends to be a selection for beneficial memes. That maybe they're not doing everything perfectly, but it's better that you practice this meme rather than not practice the meme statistically, because in order for memes to survive and propagate, they have to be passed on by people. If the people that are propagating you end up dead, then there's going to be less of you. If the people that are propagating you end up with even more people, then that's great for you. So yeah. So that like that's totally a thing that can occur. Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose what I wonder about the most in this is like, now these might all be equal. You probably have some insight into this more than I would. These might all be equal in their capacity to lead to these termination events, but I have a sneaking suspicion that one of them is greatly more likely to be able to do so, given what we've discussed so far. You have the genotypic, the phenotypic, and the memotypic. Now, genotypic, like you could have extinction events like we've discussed before, like 99% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct, and they're extinct for all types of different reasons. Sometimes it might be like evolutionary speciations that happen over time where technically it's the same genetic heritage going down, but that particular instantiation encapsulated in a species no longer exists. Like, what was that old ape that we're all evolved from?
Oh, Australopithecus.
Yeah. Australopithecus is technically extinct, but it's only extinct because we exist. It's not extinct because it died from like some type of natural calamity like an earthquake or a volcano. Technically, it survived, but at the same time ceased to be because we evolved from it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that take any I what are primates? Are primates they're not in order. Um, I forget. But with the primates, it's they're like a tree. You have a big trunk, and then it has branches, and some of those branches, they die off, but the trunk
Mhm.
it continues, and we are one of the branches from the trunk. And
Yeah. So
sometimes one of
it's
those
from my
branches
perspective.
kind of creates its own tree almost. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. From my perspective, like the genotypic is the most solid and stable. Now, that stability is not guaranteed. It's not metaphysically stable. It's not eternal in its derivation, but it is the most stable out of the three of these. Then you have the phenotypic. Now, in the phenotypic, I think that gets slightly less stable and it can be more prone to cause like suicidal or extinction level events within that paradigm. Less so than the genotypic, because in the phenotypic, what you could have is like, let's say, invasive species and competition within an environment. It's like you run into this bug you've never encountered before and you have no natural genotypic defenses for it. So it just subsumes you, it eats down all these trees, and those trees go extinct because this random bug from this other part of the world, through some type of natural calamity, has now come into this environment that has no defenses against it. That's slightly less stable than the genotypic in that way.
Okay, I'm following you.
Now, weirdly enough, the most unstable would be the memotypic. And that's the one that can lead to like really quick, really catastrophic termination events, like a literal suicide or a literal like group suicide or a holocaust or a genocide or something like that. That can kill a whole bunch of things really quick and catastrophically in the matter of mere seconds on evolutionary timescales that the other two before it don't have anywhere near that capacity to do.
Yeah, I agree. They can be extremely dangerous. But the uh, they are more useful than they are dangerous. Maybe just slightly, but they're more useful uh than they are dangerous.
So it seems to me in this like evolutionary tree from the genes to the themes to the memes, it
Thank
seems
you
to
for using
me.
that word breaker. Thank you for using that word. I want to point out to everyone: if you can have a gene and you can have a meme, then you must be able to have a fiend. It must that must be a word. No one uses that word, but it's such a good word. Sorry, go ahead.
Wonderful. So out of the genes and the themes and the memes, it seems like for every advance you get, you the potentiality for taking two steps back for every step of progress seems to also increase orthogonally alongside of this. Like for all the order and success that our memotype gives us, it also can lead to like catastrophically deadly events.
Yeah, and who knows? Maybe something like AI will be one of those. Who knows?
Well, the AI, well, of all the sci-fi horror stories of AI and how wrong it can go, that can like go in multiple different directions. Now, I have some different theories on how that would be more likely to go depending on the circumstances. I think we've actually discussed that before in a previous episode. So, yeah. So it seems to me that as entropy does increase and the potentialities for entropy to enact into the world increase exponentially, it also seems that alongside that, the amount of orderliness in the world also increases because it would necessarily have to. Because if you agree that these things become less and less stable over time, there must be some type of counterbalance of stabilizing them. And because they become so grossly unstable, that counterbalance of order that is stabilizing them must always be offset in the positive direction, even if it's just a 51% bias.
Yeah. The thing that this, I mean, I wouldn't even call it so much like chaotic versus order because anything that exhibits emergent properties.
That's a metaphysical abstraction. I'm like stripping away everything and getting down to it. I know there's a whole bunch of like in betweens and complexities in here.
Yeah. So what I would say is all emergent properties exist between chaos and order, 100%. And so if you look at something like language, right? language 100% has emergent properties to it. Words are under selection. Some words fall out of favor and become extinct. Some words just pop out of nowhere, and those are like, like poggers. And so like that's a thing. But the selecting force of language is that it's useful. And so that's there are some really bad ideas out there, and they can cause really bad problems, but they don't tend to be selected for. So the ones that are useful, they do get selected for, and so that is actually the stabilizing force that ensures that not only do they keep existing, but we keep existing.
Mm. And if you ever wondered before about my vaporwave universe that we've talked about before, I won't get into that in much detail here. That it's come up several times before, I think, in previous episodes. But my perspective, from like getting back to the whole reason we started this, which is because the pataphysical, my perspective that the pataphysical is a type of monadic manifold that all of these confluences between order and chaos take place on. And at some inevitable point in the future, given what we've discussed about just in the field of biology, the gene, the pheme, and the meme, and how they both get simultaneously more ordered and more chaotic over time, I think that if you play this out to its ultimate conclusion over the time span of the existence of an entire universe, what would ultimately happen is a type of apophatic convergence on a pure Platonic Henad.
I don't think that I mean, of course, this is just pure speculation that both of us are doing. But I would disagree. I think that you end up with extremely complex systems with massive emergent properties that would be completely incomprehensible to our monkey mind.
Well, if you go with the model of the universe that is expanding and entropy is always increasing, that's one of the only guarantees in the universe. If you go with that model, this will necessarily have to reach a type of terminal impasse, and diminishing returns will stack up, and it will reconverge through the butterfly effect towards a zeroing out point.
You mean like at the end of the universe when all the stars are dead, like that far into the future?
It starts before that, but that's where it gets to. Because if you have these emergent complex systems, but entropy is always increasing, there's always that chaotic thumb on the scale throughout the totality of the universe's existence all the way to the end. At some point, you must reach a point of diminishing returns where complexity can no longer increase and must therefore diminish back into simplicity.
Yeah, I think that complex systems you have to have an input of chaos and order for them to exist. If the order or the chaos starts to go away, so does the emergent property. So like if you run out of energy and just entropy just keeps increasing, then yeah, absolutely things die off. Yeah, I mean, nothing lasts forever, right?
Yeah, but this wouldn't happen like catastrophically all at once, like a bang and it's over. It would like taper off. That's why if you look at the Lorentz equation that produces the butterfly effect, where it's like those butterfly wings, if you map that out on a graph, you'll see that at a certain point it like exponentially increases in complexity, and then it logarithmically shrinks down and tapers off and converges back to zero.
Yeah, it's probably yeah, it wouldn't be an immediate catastrophe. It would be a slow death. But yeah, I agree.
And that's why there's like this theory in chaos theory mathematics that true chaos, like the true metaphysical chaos, doesn't actually exist, at least insofar it could be calculable and discretized. Because everything calculable and discretized, no matter like that double pendulum experiment where you have the chaotic pendulum, even that can be algebratized down to a simple equation, believe it or not.
Well, I don't know, because what you're doing there is you're saying, okay, we have a mathematical model of something. Like I can model a pendulum, but it's still just a model. There's like it's um it's it's difficult. Okay. Let me put it like this. In my position, and I think most people would at least agree with this. The qualia is more basal than the language. The qualia is actually much more basal than the language. So the qualia can through lots of complex emergent whatever it can and with monkeys it can eventually produce language, right? Qualia can eventually produce language. And it can do it 100%. But language cannot turn around and start describing qualia, right? Like it can't do it. It's not possible. In the same way, I think that you can model aspects of the universe using mathematics, but you can't actually find out anything that is true about the universe using mathematics. You can't breach that barrier.
Well, with the type of rational empiricist truth that I believe you're talking about, yes, under that paradigm, it would be impossible. But pay close attention to what you just said. Like, in this evolution of the building of complex systems over time, I think it's more accurate to say, in my opinion, that you can't like reverse engineer certain things, like the language can't directly reverse engineer the qualia that gave rise to it and it emerged from.
Yeah. So
the reason for that is that the paradigm itself has grown.
For instance, just as another for instance, I just thought of, for instance, your consciousness emerges from, I guess, your neuronal architecture inside your brain. So that large structure with 100 billion neurons can produce your consciousness, but you can't go back and say, oh yes, I can tell you exactly how my brain works. Neuron number 5 billion is firing right now, and that's why I'm able to think about that. You can't do it, right? So there's like a one-way aspect, like you were saying. Sorry to interrupt.
I know Christopher Langan. If anyone wants to go to ctmu.org and try and read his like mind-bending papers about this,
don't try it.
I'm not claiming that I fully understand it myself, but I do get some interesting like philosophical ideas to chew on when I study him. In his system, he has something he calls the conspansive manifold that contains concepts like meta-simultaneity and meta-time. So when we're talking about emergent complexity, for example, and the language can't make direct statements of the qualia, and like in Gödel's incompleteness theorem, when you exhaust all of your finite axioms in set theory, it leads to this systemic contradiction where you have to give it a post hoc meaning from outside the system. The system does not internally self-validate from your perspective. I think it's because the perspectivity itself, the very paradigm, and this would even apply to the genes, themes, and memes that I brought up before, the very paradigm, the manifold itself has expanded. And it's not that you can no longer, you don't have the tools necessary to do it. It's that the tools you're employing themselves are actually too complicated to reach back into that more simple manifold. Just like if you drop a drop of food coloring inside of a glass of water and wait until it disperses and the whole water turns purple, for example, you can't reverse engineer down to the atomic level every single particle of that food coloring back into the dropper.
Yeah, of course. The food coloring in the water and how you can't extract it back out is actually a demonstration of entropy. So and you can't turn entropy backwards. You only go forwards with entropy. So maybe I'm not saying it's exactly entropy, but maybe it's something like that. Why it is that there seems to be a direction when it comes to these complex emergent properties. Why it is that you can't use language to describe qualia. It just it's on the other side of the entropy. Sorry.
But remember what we talked about before. Whereas the universe increases in entropy, at a certain terminal impasse, complexity can no longer increase. But if entropy is the reason the complexity was increasing in the first place, once that terminal impasse is reached and it starts to go in reverse order, entropy would technically be reversing as it trended towards zero.
Mm, no, it would be it's not that the entropy would be reversing. I think it's just that the higher level systems would probably be the first to die off, right? So it's like well, they would almost have to be. So uh it's like when a person has dementia or something, like they stop being able to remember things, but their body's still going, their heart's still going, like they can still experience pain, all that kind of stuff, but oh, they can't do math anymore, right? So maybe something like that. It's not that it's not that it would be that the entropy would inverse. That's not possible. But you would lose the highest order systems.
Well, yeah, like the example you're using, though, is of a particular agent that still would be existing in the universe as we currently know it, and you would be correct in that assessment you just made. But when the very fabric of reality itself goes through this change, that's what I'm talking about.
Well, I think that I don't know. Nobody knows what happens when reality changes or whatever. I don't know. I have no idea.
There's theories in physics that have to do with like, is the universe cyclic or does the universe just end at the entropic heat death and that's all she wrote and there's never going to be another one. There's all types of theories, like even like physicists and like theoretical mathematician people will mull over these theories. It's like there's this term, I think it was Paul Vanderklay that made this analogy, like religion still exists, but now you have your choice of hot and cold running eschatology on tap, which basically means is like, does the universe die in heat death, or does the universe freeze out, or how does the universe die?
Actually, speaking of which, this was a thought that I had, because I know that all the physicists, they want to come up with a grand unified theory so that they can finally know the truth of the universe. I'm not sure if it's possible using just mimetic objects. I'm not really confident that you can do that, but hey, you know what? You can try. But I was there's this object that Eric Weinstein is actually he really likes a lot. He has this like idea of geometric unity, and there's something that he talks about called the Hopf vibration, and it's like this like very complicated looking structure, but and he says this is the secret to the universe. This is how we figure everything out. But it's actually it's basically a hyper-dimensional version with some different math stuff going on with it. It's kind of above my head, but it's based on a circle, and that's how I know that it's probably bullshit. Because a circle is a platonic object that human beings came up with one day. Circles don't actually exist in the universe. Maybe orbits kind of look like circles. Maybe planets kind of look like spheres, but they're not real things. And so if you're going to try to come up with a like some true statement about the universe, I would usually avoid just going with platonic objects that are based off of simple platonic things that humans came up with one day. Like, I would suspect that something like what Stephen Wolfram is doing with his cellular automata, where actually no human came up with that. It's actually something that does just emerge from this iterated pattern. That is, I'm not saying that he's going to get to a grand unified theory of the universe with that, but that seems closer to being able to come up with something than whatever it is that they're doing in physics and whatever the hell Eric Weinstein is whatever Eric Weinstein is talking about. That would be my estimation.
I looked a bit into Stephen Wolfram. There's some interesting stuff that I'll probably continue to go over as time goes on. But usually how I come to this at least in my weird philosophical way of doing this. I don't claim to be a physicist or a great theoretical mathematician or anything like this, but in my philosophical way of doing this, this is kind of why I eventually went to the pataphysical domain, at least insofar as like my attempts to explain my theories of everything in the universe. Take them or leave them as you will, but
I'm gonna be honest, man. I've talked with you numerous times about pataphysics, and I looked it up, and I even I listened to some other people talk about pataphysics, and I still don't understand it. Am I too grug-brained, or just does it not make sense? Like I I don't know what's going on.
well, like I said before, like all scientific paradigm breakthroughs from Einstein to Newton and Euclid, like take your pick of great luminaries in science and mathematics over the centuries and millennia, um, without fail, it always, like all the breakthroughs, they're called breakthroughs because they shatter an established paradigm, which tells you something that your preconceived notions of, like, you often like to criticize metaphysics, and I don't entirely disagree with you on that. Like, if you have this perfect metaphysical version of the world, it only takes one crazy old man drawing triangles in the sand to just break that, and it only takes like some crazy German Jew in the form of Albert Einstein holding up a mirror and imagining to himself, if I were a photon, would I be invisible in this mirror? It's like these weird, totally imaginary things like this that lead to the paradigm breakthroughs. Now, yes, I know there's a whole bunch of other things attached to that, like these were brilliant people with a massive mathematical and scientific acumens that were able to apply this knowledge, and that's why I told you before, you have to be like this perfect combination of really smart and really crazy. Not too crazy and not too smart, because if you're too smart, you just become a line-towing toady, like you criticize the modern-day scientific establishment for being all too often. And if you're too crazy, you're just a homeless man saying the end is near on the street corner.
Well, and you probably need a third thing as well. Probably disagreeableness. You have to want to say fuck you to the whole system.
Yeah, you have to now. Sometimes I understand what you're saying, but sometimes that's not always an explicit act of will. Sometimes you
Yep.
might just accidentally stumble upon this, and it might be, oh, here's the thing, let me show it to some people. Everyone you show it to is like, you're crazy, get out of here, that messes up all our rules and theories and blah blah blah, get the fuck out of here, you crazy person. Which is all too often what happens with these people. It's not so much disagreeableness as it is a type of assertiveness. Disagreeableness could be part of the equation, but what actually wins out and breaks the paradigm is assertiveness, which might not even be in line with disagreeableness. Like, these people might think to themselves, and I imagine they often do, that they've actually stumbled upon some deeper truth that their contemporaries and the ones that came before them never yet realized, and it's up to them to put this theory forward into the world and be very forceful with it.
Yeah. Okay, so what's
or it could just be cantankerous coots that just was like, I'm right, fuck you.
Okay. So what's pataphysics?
Okay. It's all the imaginary solution, always turn 5 times. Now, the 5 5s is like a really esoteric, automatically written thing I came up with, so you would have to know a lot of like other complex systems that converged upon that to begin to understand that, and I would have to like hours of lecturing to explain everything that goes into that before you would get what the meaning of that is. But
well,
to make a long story short,
I think that I think that both of us kind of have an issue with metaphysics, and we're trying to go somewhere else. And I'm trying to head towards axiology. You're trying to head towards pataphysics. But yeah, go ahead.
well, here's the thing. It's like, consider to yourself, it's like you often like to criticize the perfect abstract Platonic circles and shapes and things like this. Did you ever consider that the actual reason you don't see them emerging in the material world is because there's too much entropic background noise for them to do so?
I mean, it could be, but why is there? Why? Okay. Why are there Why is it that these Platonic things actually would exist out there in the ether? And how is it that the human monkey mind was able to stumble upon this reality transcending object. Like I'm not sure any of that is real.
Well, that's like the eternal mystery of pataphysics and why the ultimate definition of it remains ineffable. It's like, how did these people, with just their minds and monkey brains and imaginations to go off of, you can't deny that these people did actually make breakthroughs. Like, if it wasn't for Euclid's elements, like, you wouldn't have a house.
Well, yeah, look, I think, well, you could still have one. I mean, it's called a cave. But I think that with these like, okay, I think that the smartest scientist to ever live, Breaker, you know who I believe it is.
Mr. Darwin, yeah.
That's exactly right. He was not German. What the don't ever call Charles Darwin German. That's
I knew that would piss you off. It's the Axiology, wisdom of nature.
Okay, Charles Darwin, probably brightest scientist to ever live, definitely bigger brain than Einstein, and I think that his principles of natural selection and the way that evolution works seem extremely correct to me. And yet, I would still say it's probably not exactly correct. There's probably things that are going on in Darwinism that we don't know, and maybe we'll learn more. But I don't think that we'll ever understand the entire process, because I have a suspicion that it's not just so simple that you have replicators that can mutate and they exist in an environment that selects for them. I think it's probably pretty accurate, but there's probably things that are going on there that we can't be certain of. I mean, for instance, like what Jean-Francois Gary P might say is that, well, you know, even underlying that, there's actually like a structure of quantum selection that actually underlies that whole process. And so, I mean, who knows? But yeah, I guess what you're trying to say is that pataphysics is what can allow a person to actually grasp onto these truths about the universe.
Yeah, and it's not discrete and systematic like a purely mathematical rule set or anything like that. It's much more fleeting and ephemeral. Sometimes these things come to people randomly in dreams. Now, they might have dreamed something completely different. If they ate toast instead of bacon that day, they might have not even had that dream. Like, all these complex systems converging on one another. It's mind-boggling to think the scope of it, but nonetheless, these things happen. These things can come to people out of pure imagination or just a simple dream. It's like, in my dream, I saw 2 balls, and I put a 3rd ball in the bag. And then I took the ball out, and I realized, like, I've changed the order of the balls.
Okay. All right, so it's almost like a you have I guess so okay, if I understand this, pataphysics is where it is possible for a human being to just know some sort of true thing about the universe, but in order to know the true thing, you have to go a little bit crazy and be very creative, and maybe, just maybe, you'll stumble onto a golden nugget. Maybe.
Yeah, and you have to be smart enough to bring that out. If you want it to be brought out and be like a theory that obtains into the world, like Euclid's elements of geometry, you kind of have to be kind of big brain to whittle this emergent pataphysical background noise that's always bombarding you down to something that razor sharp.
Yep. So this is where we're in disagreement, because I'm not sure that it's possible for human beings to really understand anything about base reality. I mean, I think that you can never reach true ontology.
I never claimed that you could reach true ontology. You may have mistaken me, because even Euclid's Elements, it's like the four postulates of Euclid, like all the geometricians and mathematicians throughout the last 2,000 plus years, pretty much figured the first four out. What was the surprising one was the fifth one. And if you don't know, if two parallel straight lines remain parallel, do they ever converge or diverge? Now, the original
It depends on the what the shape of the plane is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would depend. Now, people didn't get to that level until 2,000 years after Euclid had already written this book. And then you came up with different theories. I think M theory of the universe is where the lines inevitably converge. And there's another theory, I forget the name of it, where they diverge necessarily. But you can have different models of the universe just based on a crazy old man drawing triangles in the sand over 2,000 years ago.
I do want to point out that based off of I think all the experiments that we've done so far, we appear to exist in a Euclidean 3D geometry. It appears as though we, based off of our best estimates, we don't seem to exist in a non-Euclidean three-dimensional geometry. But I mean, further testing is required.
And it would also be the problem of the entropic background noise that I talked about. And that's why I made the original argument. It's like, now, if there was ever a point in the universe where the complexity decreased, you would actually, whether or not entropy was still increasing or decreasing on like a more meta level, you seem to be of the opinion that it would be still increasing even after the point where complexity decreased. Even though the increase in emergent complexity is due to entropy, that would be a strange juxtaposition that would happen.
Both entropy and order must exist.
So it seems if there's ever these forces ever reverse, order would take precedence over entropy in that case. Like if complexity starts to shrink in the universe on a macro universe level scale, order would be taking over and chaos would be becoming subsumed. Now, assuming there's anything left like a mind to ponder these type of questions at that point, which you're not guaranteed to have, by the way, you would nonetheless have a situation where that type of entropic background noise would actually be reduced, and the universe itself would physically instantiate more perfectly abstract geometric forms the closer it got to zero. Now, this would always be asymptotic. They would never technically, quote unquote, exist in anything you could conceptualize as an actual physical universe that really exists.
I'm not sure that you can that just because the universe goes full heat death that suddenly platonic objects start existing in reality. I think that's I don't think that you can make that claim. Also, I would like to point out that there is complexity. I mean, I guess that there's sort of a complexity in the universe. Like if you look at a galaxy, like that looks like a pretty complex object. You do have like some like complex gravitational stuff happening that goes way beyond the three-body problem. Also, we're not sure why it is that the outskirts of a galaxy can actually rotate that fast. That's why we've inserted dark matter and just decided that that's a real thing, even though no one's found any evidence for it.
Yeah, it's a placeholder term for theoretical physics, basically.
Yeah, but I think that here's the thing. Within your pataphysics, I think that there's an idea that there are real equations or shapes or whatever have you, but let's say equations. There are real equations that exist and that are the building blocks of the universe, but the universe exists as the equations plus chaos. And so maybe we can figure out the equations, but we can't figure out the intersection of chaos plus the equations. And so the maybe I'm saying this is the pataphysical perspective. And so maybe you can grasp onto the equation. You won't be able to determine how that interacts with the chaos, but you can at least do something similar. Maybe that is the case, but I think that at least how human beings exist, we have to live in a world where, assuming that there is that equation out there, and I don't think that there is, but assuming that there is that equation out there, it has already blended with chaos so much that the properties that we have to deal with on Earth have very little to do with equations.
Mm. This is one of the reasons why trigonometry was innovated in calculus, because if you try and measure like a curve on a grid, you very quickly run into a discretizability problem where it's like, okay, if I want to finitely measure this curve on this grid, how many points do I need to take into consideration? And you start to realize, like, well, there are infinite derivations of points. That's why in trigonometry, you come up with something like limits. That's why there's trigonometric limits. It's like, okay, I only need this much fidelity and information, pragmatically speaking, to make this equation work for some type of practical application. Now, the actual philosophy of that curve and what it really is gets into like a really ooey gooey, extremely metaphysical thing that you're not going to find anywhere in the physical world because of the Planck limit that wasn't discovered until a few decades after that, but yeah, or maybe even a century after that, after the time of Newton. Yeah, that level of fidelity, like technically you only need 52 decimal places of pi, I think, to calculate the circumference of the entire known universe. So these transcendental numerals aren't even necessary for like more pragmatic and practical applications of physics and science if you're wanting to measure quote unquote real things.
Yeah, yeah. But I guess that but am I correct in saying that the point of this pataphysics is that you want to at least be able to identify the equation that blends with the chaos? Is that, am I correct in
Yeah,
saying that? Yeah.
because on the curve, it's just like, pataphysically speaking, that curve does exist and is infinitely rich in its fidelity. But insofar as you are concerned as a mortal finite being, it's just like, unless you want to spend eternity counting all the infinite points of that curve on that plane, you're going to say at a certain point, fuck it, I only need this much resolution. And
Okay.
it's because that infinitely variable and smooth curve does in fact exist is the reason why trigonometric limits were devised to deal with that pragmatically.
So I here's my perspective. If I were to guess at how the universe works, and again, this is just pure speculation. Um, but if I were to make my own guess at how the universe works, I would assume that it's something similar to a cellular automata. Um, like if I were to ask you what's the equation for like rule 110. Well, you could give me like the individual like 8-bit rule that each pixel is following. You could definitely do that. Um, and maybe you could discover that. But the actual objects that it produces are just in non understandable and also the scope of the universe essentially non calculable. So I like my perspective is that there is no equation. You have some sort of iterated rule, and yeah, we exist with that. There is no equation in my perspective.
Mm. Yeah, and that's why in my pataphysical philosophy, I refer to metaphysics as derivatives, just like in calculus, where you have these converging sequences and these complex polynomials, which in this case would represent convergences of order and chaos. Now, there's infinitely many metaphysical derivatives depending on the origin points that you could derive in this scenario. And given the multifaceted, extreme complexity of the totality of the universe, you would kind of expect to see, if not an infinite number, you don't necessarily need to go that far. You would see like a very massive number. I remember a few days ago we were talking about Graham's number and the implications of that. Now, if humans will ever derive like what number that is less than Graham's number, if this does exist, in which a type of uniform flat plane becomes unavoidable and must necessarily exist within this dimensional matrix. Who knows if humans will ever find that? That is a mind-bogglingly large number. And if it turns out to be Graham's number, then you're just fucked. You're never going to find it. But you do find along the way, making my pataphysical analogy, you find these metaphysical derivative points, which there are technically infinitely many of, that you could derive depending on your starting points. But the starting points, the question is, are there infinitely many of those? And I'm not entirely sure about those.
You're saying, like, for instance, mathematics. It has a series of axioms that it rests on, not axiology, axioms. And in theory, I guess you could actually choose a different set of axioms and get a different set of mathematics, or a different game essentially.
Well, there's this guy that me and Parallax knew, a Catholic friend of mine. His name was Sven Nelson. You can still find him. He has a Discord server if you're interested in like computer coding and complex logic. And he developed a system of logic specifically to employ in quantum computing called path semantics. And in path semantics, you don't so much have discrete axioms as you have quasi-pluripotent axioms. And that way you don't run into the Gödel's incompleteness set theory problem as quickly, if at all, depending on how you calculate these. Because in Gödel's incompleteness theorem, you have 10 discrete axioms that mean what they mean and they mean nothing else. But if you have pluripotent axioms that are context dependent and perspective dependent, then you have a bit more emergent complexity and you have more wiggle room to work with. Now, whether or not you'll still encounter the incompleteness problem, at this point it would be so mind-bogglingly complex that you may never know.
Variable axioms, you say? Interesting.
Yeah, like Parallax called it the Joker's calculus. It's sort of like fuzzy logic, but it actually works with practical applications. The problem is when he first did the equations for this, he found over 4 billion different path semantics. And so far, him and his people have only worked through a few thousand of them. So, yeah. But at least it's smaller than fucking Graham's number.
Well, yeah, I mean, you would end up with a combinatoric explosion of how many. I mean, what if? I don't know how many axioms he's utilizing. Like maybe it's 10, maybe it's something else. But if you were to if you could vary the number of axioms that you actually have to begin with, and you could vary like what those axioms are, and I would predict that actually you could create a lot of different axioms. Like I don't even know how many axioms you could produce that are distinct to each other. I would expect that you actually are finding a number that's much larger than 4 billion.
Yeah, the thing of it is, the first equation he did of this yielded 4 billion, and that was just the first equation he did. And he's trying to go through and like split the wheat from the chaff and see how many of them just lead to gobbledygook and illogical shit. So far, he's found like 4,000 viable ones, but further studying is being done on that.
Wow.
Now, sometimes it might be just pure illogic, like horses are made of cheese level shit. It's just like, not really. But go on to the next one. But this is like the reason why I employ pataphysics, because, you know, you might think horses made of cheese is totally ridiculous, but perspectively, if you ruminate on it a bit, you might actually also find it's like, wait a minute. Horses, there are female horses that give milk, and milk is an ingredient of cheese. So technically, horses are a potentiality that could lead to the existence of cheese, but they're not in and of themselves cheese. But you see how that's not entirely a useless thing to say horses are made of cheese.
I mean, yeah, I guess like ultimately the marker for if any of these constructions, like if any of these dudes 4,000 new sets of axioms or the original OG math, the reason why it is that these are useful is the reason why they're useful is because they help humans out. So like I would say that they're I'm not even sure that you can platonically just say, yes, this is useful. this is good. I mean, there's a reason why it's useful, and that's because it benefits humans, and that's actually how we get back all the way back to axiology.
Hmm. But insofar as like you define benefit to humans, like we also discussed, sometimes humans can just like go off on these total side tangents that do nothing that even vaguely approaches reproductive success, and they can still very much value these things. Now, if it were totally locked into the materialistic, naturalistic paradigm that you propose, that should be like effectively impossible, but it's not.
Well, okay, I think that the usefulness can be kind of broadly defined here. So, like obviously going out into the jungle and killing a deer and bringing it back to the tribe, that's clearly useful. But what about like the musician, right? Like, well, what he's doing is useful because people are willing to pay for his music. Then why is music useful? I'm not sure, but 100%. Whenever I fuck, I have music in the background, and it's usually Nirvana or Coldplay. So yeah, I don't know.
I'll tell you something. Since you brought up music and hunter gatherers, I'll tell you something about that. There's also an aspect of ritual involved with a lot of hunter gatherer tribes. Now, when I describe this to you, you're immediately going to want to discount it probably as something totally irrational and logical. But let's say there's a bunch of hunter gatherers and they have this ritual that they've devised. They're basically doing magic. Literal magic is what they're doing. Where before they go out on a hunt, they draw like a crude pictogram of a deer in the dirt, and a shaman comes out and does a dance with a chicken or monkey bones or whatever, and blesses the magic arrow from a magic bow that's only used in this ritual. And then this hunter will shoot this drawn deer, this totemistic deer in the sand, in the neck with this magic bow. And then when they go out on the real hunt, they'll bring back a deer that they shot through the neck with an arrow. Now, you immediately want to say, it's okay, this is obviously coincidental, and this didn't actually affect the fabric of reality and magically cause that hunter's arrow to fly into the deer's neck because they did this ritual. You can rationalize this the way in all types of ways, but what doesn't change, to go back to music that you talked about, Nirvana and these guitar playing musicians are kind of an interesting example of this. What you do actually notice with things like these type of superstitions and ritualistic behaviors and mythic and religious behaviors, you can get guitarists are very superstitious. Like they'll think that my magic tone woods, like my mahogany guitar sounds better than your cedar guitar because mahogany is a denser wood. It's a tone wood, you see, and the tone is more exotic. Now, empirically, you can test these quote unquote tone woods in musical instruments, and especially electric guitars and stuff, and you can see it's like you can make this guitar out of fucking epoxy or concrete, and it would sound exactly the same in a double blind test, even all the way down to a fucking spectrogram. That wood ain't being an EQ, and it ain't adding or taking away no fucking tone from those notes in electric guitars. But that doesn't actually change qualitatively when the guitarist picks up what he thinks is a mahogany guitar, and you could even hand him a guitar that's just plastic with paint on it and say, oh yeah, this is mahogany, and he would have no way of knowing. But in his mind, if he thinks it's a mahogany guitar, that's going to have a qualitative difference in the type of music that he produces. That is empirically verifiable. So there is something happening here with the intersection of empiricism and magic, if only in the human mind, that is causing measurably different results.
Well, that's I mean, that's essentially the placebo effect, right? Like these with the example of the hunter gatherer shooting the pictogram of the deer, like, you know, you said that, and I was thinking, yeah, I there has to be a reason why they do that. I may not be able to, as a human, understand exactly what's going on with that, why that's working. Like I may never know. But the fact that it exists tells you that it's useful. In the same way that I as a human, I may not be able to know exactly why it is that pain exists. I mean, I can take some pretty educated guesses, but I may not be able to know the exact reason, but I know that there is a reason why it exists. It must be useful. Because if it wasn't useful, it wouldn't exist.
I'm not disputing you there. What I'm saying, and it also goes in line with your reasoning about this, is through this emergent complexity and your inability to backtrace this to its teleological origin points or classify it with discrete ontologies, like this emergent behavior these hunter-gatherers have, or this emergent behavior these electric guitarists with superstitions about tone would have, there has been a new emergent complexity that is a type of meta-system operating on a previously established system that, like with the guitars themselves, like you can look at the tone woods and empirically study them and see if there's any difference in tone between different woods. And you find it's like, these readings are inconclusive, therefore I must conclude that there's no actual appreciable difference that a human could hear between these tone woods. And you can actually do that scientifically, but what the guitar player is doing...
Science is wrong about that, yes.
Well, what the guitar player is doing is actually proving that assumption wrong, because the quality of their music changes depending on the placebo effect, as you put it. So the placebo effect is doing something that is measurable and verifiable, and that's why you have to go out of your way and jump through hoops backwards to weed it out of clinical double-blind tests.
Yeah.
Because it's such a confounding variable that you have to go out of your way to get rid of it.
Yeah, you know what? The placebo effect itself, I don't know why it exists, but it must be useful, otherwise it wouldn't exist.
But you may never know exactly why it's useful, and your first assumption wants to be that it's useful for the propagation and continued evolution of the organism. That's the most rational explanation you come to employing the scientific method and Occam's razor, and says, okay, it must be useful because it was naturally selected in favor of, because it gave some type of survival edge, or it weighted the scales of order off of the 50-50 bias and biased it in that direction. However you want to cut this cake.
That's why almost anything in nature
you would want to say.
Yeah,
that's the first thing you would want to say. But because this is an emergent complex system, you can't actually empirically verify that claim when it switches between systems and you have building of meta-perspectivity.
Well, okay, let me give you this, okay? It might be part of a larger object. So, like sometimes something gets let's take like a gene or something. Sometimes a gene gets introduced by whatever mechanism, and it has to be like a whole thing, but it produces a kind of like a good, like a really beneficial thing, but then maybe like also a negative thing. But the beneficial thing outweighs the negative thing. So or like if you look at certain religions, right? Overall, they are beneficial to humanity. If they weren't beneficial, then they would be a cult and they would die out. But maybe not everything about the religion is beneficial to humanity, but the overall structure is overall beneficial. There's some really good parts, maybe there's some bad parts, but also there's some really good parts. So, like when it comes to like structures in memetics, structures in the phenotype, structures in the mind, and by the way, your mind, your consciousness, it exists somewhere between the phene and the meme. It isn't really entirely one or the other. There could be just structures that exist there, and there may not be actually a reason for them. Maybe like the placebo effect. It could be that it exists because it's part of some other structure, and so there's a reason why it exists, but it itself doesn't really entirely justify its own existence. But it's part of this larger structure, so that larger structure does justify its own existence. Something like that.
I don't think I entirely disagree with your take there. The only thing I would say to like put a finer point on that is to caution you, like when you're employing these methodologies, because okay, what you already have, if what you say is true, well, I don't have much reason to doubt it. And that's why I kind of like get into these head in the clouds, transcendental type of things to try and get away from that as much as possible. But let's just go with your take on this. Now, what you would have is a type of quasi-tautology happening here that's very subtle and hard to see if you don't know what you're looking for. Because what you're saying is, okay, I'm starting out from, like, the admission you make starting out is already has bias front-loaded into it. Because you existing as a human wanting to maximize your reproduction and eat and do all of these things, like, you already front-load that bias in there.
Of course.
And that's really fundamental bias you have that you admit to forthrightly. But then you take that bias and then you reflect back on, like, okay, what are the causal factors? Let me do some science here. Let me think about some evolution here. Let me get to the nature god. Let me take communion with the nature god, or however you want to cut this cake. But you're already front-loaded the bias, so that's like two turns of, like, two meta layers of self-tautological bias that you've already applied to this. And then now you're getting into, like, a third layer of tautological bias, where it's just like, well, maybe there's a more complex system, more complex than me, that's responsible for the reason I do these complex things. And that's 3 layers of tautological bias. And you can actually get into a 4th layer of tautological bias. It's like, okay, maybe this is like a mythic, legendary, godlike instantiation of this that is pluripotent and responsible for all complex things, such as me. This is why I think about it. And that's 4 layers of bias. There's actually a 5th layer that breaks this whole paradigm and gives you the meta-perspectivity to see all of this connecting in this way. And that's why I said in my weird automatic writing philosophical screed, the 5 fives always turn 5 times.
Okay. What's the 5th layer? What's the 5th level?
The 5th layer isn't necessarily something I can explicitly tell you or put into words even. It has to come from, like, a sudden aha moment derived from the pure pataphysical. You can't reach it through any type of pre-existing metaphysical derivatives or any type of pre-existing epistemological maps or any type of axiological pre-existing sensualities, which you've already admitted you had the bias in the first place. There, you're back at square one again.
I mean, look, you might be correct about that, but that mostly sounds like an assertion.
Yeah, you can take it as that if you want to. And there's no guarantee that most people will ever get to this level where they're able to answer that 5th turn question. That's why in my philosophical system, the 5th is the jester and the trickster. It's constantly lying to you and reaffirming biases, or it's breaking those paradigms but in a nonsensical and whimsical way. Only when the jester and the trickster esoterically blend into one and there is no more distinction do you get to the rarefied realm of the stranger, as I call it, where you can actually have this enlightened awareness of what's happening here.
I mean, anything is possible. I think that I think that to bring this all back, I think that between you and me, I am more ordered and you are more chaotic.
I am beyond order and chaos. I have seen the Elysian fields.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, you know what? I think that was an interesting conversation. I think it was a high quality one. I don't know if everyone is going to be able to entirely follow it. Because I know that you and I we use terms that, you know, because like you and I talk pretty often. Some of these terms they come, we're just like, yeah, of course that's it. Like fiend, right? I'm pretty sure I don't know if anyone else who uses that word. So I hope that at least it was somewhat followable to other people that don't you know constantly have these sort of conversations. But yeah, if you like what we're doing on this channel, if you want more of this style of video, by the way, I know that we don't usually do like this style too much, because much more cerebral, a little bit less entertaining and memey. But if you like this style of content, hey, leave a like, smash that subscribe button, leave a comment, share this with your your great aunt on Facebook. I'm sure that she'll get a lot of enrichment from this. Any closing remarks, Breaker?
5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Always turning 5 times. This is the secret of the trickster.
Okay, everyone, avoid schizophrenia. Peace out.